Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Salam alaikum. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this very important hui. I'd like to start by acknowledging mana whenua and how nice it is to be back in Ūrohi. I'd also extend my best regards to the Muslim community here in Ōtautahi and further afield. In doing so, I recognise your grief and loss, and thank you for the way in which you continue to open your hearts and lives to those of us who have a lot to learn about the issues you continue to face, myself included. It may seem unusual for there to be someone from Oranga Tamariki, New Zealand's Ministry for Children, speaking at a hui focused on countering terrorism. To be honest, when I went to social work school 30 years ago, not for a moment did it cross my mind that I would find myself in front of an audience of this nature talking about an issue like counter-terrorism. However, here we are in the year 2021, where the nature of statutory social work is changing, and we, like many others, are faced with complex challenges impacting the lives of people in our communities. The perspective I'm here to bring today to these discussions is specific to the impact issues like terrorism and extremism have for children and young people and their families. Where harm occurs to people, you can be sure there will be children impacted, and so it should be no surprise that sadly issues of terrorism and extremism are very real for some of our children and young people. First, a few quick things by way of context about the area I work in. Oranga Tamariki is responsible for the delivery of statutory child protection, youth justice and adoption services. I say statutory as that largely sets us apart from the many groups, organisations, individuals and agencies which provide support to children and their families in our country. We become involved when we are notified of a concern about serious harm to children, an insecurity of care for them, or a young person is thought to have offended. This involves children both living in New Zealand as well as Kiwi kids who may be located overseas. And as any child living in New Zealand, no matter what nationality, ethnicity or where they're from. Unlike many others at this hui, I'm not an academic. I'm a qualified social worker who has had the privilege of working in this area of the public service for a very, very long time. My current role covers areas of child protection and youth justice practice, which are new and emerging. As recently as 5 years ago, we were not having to think about and respond to issues like the trafficking and exploitation of children for labour and sex, modern-day slavery involving minors, unaccompanied minors seeking asylum, the movement of children across borders based on fraudulent documentation and deception, 501 deportees from Australia, and of course the topic of this hui, terrorism and extremist ideology. These issues have not been the work of everyday social workers in our organisation, and it requires us to make friends with a different range of agencies and groups. Whereas we are used to working with police, education, health and corrections, the changing nature of some of our work requires us to develop relationships with the security agencies, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Immigration Service, the Department of Internal Affairs, Customs and others, including communities across New Zealand. These complicated problems require a more complex range of relationships for us to be successful. The role of Oranga Tamariki with children and young people in the context of terrorist and extremist ideology is twofold. And I should add, we are but one of a wide range of people who have a role in the lives of children and families across New Zealand. The first role we have relates to care and protection matters and includes, with others, responsibilities for the well-being, protection and care of children and young people living in families where extremism and terrorist ideology exists, is promoted and or acted on. We also have a role with young people who come to the attention of agencies for concerns for actions relating to their behaviour. Our Youth Justice Service works closely with police and others to respond to concerns for young people in the context of youth offending. The approach taken is one of focusing on both the deeds and the needs of young people whose behaviour may be harmful or a threat to the safety of others. In responding to these issues, we have domestic and international obligations. The Treaty of Waitangi sets the foundation for the way in which the Crown must work with our treaty partners. It's no secret that Oranga Tamariki is learning some very hard lessons at the moment about how we have gone about working with Tamariki Māori, their whānau, hapu and iwi. Helpfully, the Waitangi Tribunal has recently reported following an urgent inquiry, and now the onus is on us to work with others to figure out what we must do to make the changes required. When I think about the work being done in response to terrorist and extremist ideology, the principles of partnership, protection and participation seem to me to be very important to keep front and centre of our thinking. As well as the treaty, New Zealand is a contracting state to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children, commonly known as UNCRC. The Convention sets out what children can expect by way of rights, including the right for their interests to be a primary consideration in matters affecting them, and for them to be safe with a strong sense of connection, identity and belonging, all things that I have heard talked about over the last day as important protective factors against terrorism and extremism. There are a couple of great things about the Convention. The first is that all but one country around the world is a signatory to it. This means that when we're trying to navigate complex cross-border issues for children, we have something significant in common to support engagement, shared understanding and collaboration towards outcomes for those kids. The second great thing about the Convention is that New Zealand as a whole signed up to UNCRC, not just Oranga Tamariki as the Children's Ministry. The Convention applies to all of New Zealand. We, across the public service, all have responsibilities to ensure that when we are working on matters involving children, the Convention applies. The third domestic setting which applies to this area of work is the Oranga Tamariki Act. The Act is a complex and somewhat disjointed piece of law as changes have been made in a piecemeal way over the years. However, I think the purpose of the Act resonates strongly with how we should respond to terrorist and extremist ideology, and this includes ensuring that family, whānau, hapu, iwi are actively engaged and supported to make decisions and take responsibility for the care and protection of their tamariki, assisting family, whānau, hapu and iwi to prevent harm and offending, and with respect to youth justice and youth offending, preventing or reducing offending or future offending, recognising the rights and interests of victims, holding children and young people to account and encouraging them to accept responsibility for their behaviour. Whilst we don't have tailor-made childcare and protection and youth justice legislation geared to respond to new and emerging issues involving children, what we do have is some helpful obligations and requirements within our domestic law which I think are important to incorporate when considering New Zealand's strategy to counter issues like terrorism and extremism. I've been thinking about what we have learnt so far with the children and young people that I've been involved with. In considering New Zealand's strategy to counter terrorist and extremist ideology, from the perspective of children, I would make the following observations. The first is, working effectively in this area is requiring all of those involved to build knowledge and capability in an area of practice which is not well developed. We're learning as we go. We have a way to go and a lot to learn. But the good thing about this is that we have an opportunity in front of us to develop an approach that is tailored to our unique cultural context and responsive to how we want to do things in New Zealand. The second is, frameworks of analysis are really important. Approaching cases only from the perspective of risk runs the risk of taking a deficit approach based on individualised and pathologised presumptions. This is especially relevant to our young people whom I know are concerned about issues of stigmatisation based on risk profiling. How a risk is identified, understood and responded to is really important. It requires us to take a combination of approaches, including, for example, psychological, social and cultural, and in assessing we must include needs and protective factors. The better we understand the circumstances of children and young people and their families, the more able and successful we and others will be in responding. This principle applies to all care and protection and youth justice work for as long as I've known. Issues of searching for identity, connection and belonging are key features of what many young people experience. We know this from our work with children in care. We also know this from the painful stories that people have told about the legacy of closed adoption in this country. We must protect, nurture and ensure the right all children have to be connected to who they are, where they belong, and the people and places that are important to them. Their mana must be upheld, their whakapapa protected, their whanaungatanga connections preserved. Our role and that of others is to encourage, support and facilitate this. We need to build understanding as to indicators of concern, and we need to help all of New Zealand know what they can do to intervene and respond when they see something concerning for a child, young person or their family. There are some lessons from our experience in responding to family violence that I think are important to reflect on in this context. One being that the escalation of all risks, big or small, for a single agency response will not help us. We must engage and support iwi and hapu, communities, civil society and the state, all to have a role in responding to these issues. Absolutely the state must respond when the level of risk and need warrants it, but I fear the harm that could be caused by using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and think it's vitally important that our response is commensurate with the level of risk and need children and young people experience. Online activity in the context of terrorist and extremist ideology is really hard to manage in a child protection and youth justice setting. Some young people fall into very dark places on the web. Some go searching and others land there accidentally. It's hard to oversee and supervise what content children and young people access. When access is withdrawn, it's difficult to know how to re-establish safe access. Under some circumstances, we can limit the access young people have to devices in the web, but inevitably we have to confront how these young people are reintroduced to what many of us now rely on to go about our daily lives. This is a current problem challenging all of us involved with these young people. What has become very obvious is that ultimately working together will have greater success than a single agency response. Building pro-social networks and supports around young people and their whānau makes a difference, but it takes all of us to get involved. Our response needs to reflect diversity of culture, religion and belief systems, and what we know is that family and community engagement is vital to success. Finally, a small plea. The voice of experience must be privileged in the work we do in this area. How great would it be if amongst the many important voices that need to be heard in this context and at events like this, we make a space to enable young people to share their views and experiences and to ensure that informs those of us who are in a position to influence the way New Zealand tackles these complex issues. If it's our youth who are the most at risk of radicalisation and extremism, then let's hear from them about what they think will work and what we should be doing. I bet they'd have quite a bit to say. Thank you.
Future.
I have a question in the centre of the room.
Good morning. Good morning. I did have a question, but I realise it's more about a comment, and it's focused to Oranga Tamariki. And the reason why I'm standing up is because as I was listening to the kōrero, my stomach started heating, and that told me something wasn't sitting right with me. And what I noticed, obviously, was the name Oranga Tamariki, and I'm also very well aware of the amount of Māori children that are taken from our whānau and into the state care. Another thing I was aware was that we had non-Māori presenting this talk today, and I'm very well aware of my biases. I want to mention that. I found this speech to be at a high level context and not sitting at a community level. And I think if you want to talk to ordinary people, because this is a mixed room of people at grassroots level as well as an intellectual level and academic level, I found it to be typical states oranga kōrero that was coming at a high level speech, and I wished it had been talking to the people that are really, that service is really aimed at. Last week, my friend, who is a grandmother who takes care of her granddaughter, and Oranga Tamariki is involved, had to go to a conference. And, you know, you use it's got a te reo Māori name for an organisation that looks after tamariki, but she came back upset because the manaakitanga wasn't there at that hui. Simple basic things like giving her a warm welcome. She was caring for her granddaughter, but she was treated by the public servants as though she was a perpetrator. And a cup of tea and coffee was not offered. And so she asked if there was tea and coffee available, and they said, yeah, it's over there. So these are the things that resonate with me when I'm listening to a high-level speech. I have been involved in the Muslim community for some years and have had some experience with Muslim children and Oranga Tamariki. And a story I want to share is about 6 children who were swiftly taken away by Oranga Tamariki and the police at a Muslim school and taken into care. The father was looked at as a potential terrorist, radicalised, and hence they decided to take the children away. I believe that if that demographic was different, that if he was a Pakeha man, mum was a Pakeha mother, the children were Pakeha, he would have been put into mental health care. But he was sent to prison. So obviously there's a lot more in the background, but these are some of the stories that we live and hear in the Muslim community. And so I guess my concern is with the term of jihadi brides and women who are New Zealanders coming back into this country with their children. What has the organisation actually got planned for them? Are you going to whip them out from the airport as soon as they land, whip these children into state care as soon as they land? Is there a plan in place that you could share with us? I guess that's where my question is, and I'm concerned about the relationship between how Māori children are removed from their whānau and the relationship about how Muslim children who are seen as having parents who are a threat. So my question is, how do you define that threat? And to be taken away into Oranga Tamariki and lost into a system where we are aware that there are not enough Muslim caregivers in the community to look after our own Muslim children. Thank you.
Paula, do you want to respond?
Thank you for those comments. I mean, as I said, we're having to confront some very hard issues and reality of the way our organisation has delivered services to the public of New Zealand, and it's very, we're trying really hard to listen carefully and understand what we need to do better and get right, and there's significant change afoot in the organisation to that end. I can't speak specifically about any individual cases, but what I can say that the law requires us, first and foremost, to support families to safely care for their children. And that is the ambition that I would expect applies to any children in New Zealand of any ethnicity, culture. And so, we've got a lot of work to do. We're trying to front up to some of the challenges that have been laid at our feet. There are going to be significant changes. There have been significant changes in terms of leadership of the organisation
in focus of the ministry. And I would like to hope that some of the feedback that you've provided today and that we have heard from others changes over time as we start to re-establish trust and confidence of the public in being able to provide a really great service for children and their families, one that's not characterised by removing children into state care and them feeling disconnected and never given back to where they came from. So thank you for your comments. I don't feel I can do very great justice to them in a response in this forum, but I'm happy to meet with you outside of the session if that would be of any help.
Thank you again for the comment.